You're recording. Recording has started. So I think it's probably time to get started here. Thank you all for joining us today. If you haven't found the little icon to make comments or ask us questions, down in the left-hand side of your screen is a little talk bubble. Click on that and your conversation window should open. And type any messages. Oh, hello, Blaine. Type any messages that you have or questions that you have in that window, and we will kind of run this somewhat informally, and we can answer your questions as we go. For those of you who have to leave early, or for those who haven't made it to this conversation, we are recording this so that everyone can watch later if they weren't able to get to their computer. So I think we'll kick that off. Thank you guys for joining us. I'm going to pass this over to Dave Braun with Stone Environmental to get us started.
All right. So Christy and I were talking, and we seem like we've done a tremendous amount of work in these last 6 months since being awarded this contract. And we thought it was time to sort of present that to you, kind of informally, really as a progress report, and also show you the website that is a site you can access from any machine. So really this is meant to be kind of an open exchange. If you've got questions, I recognize the technology is going to make that a little bit difficult, but certainly Christy's going to monitor the instant message stream coming in and hopefully ask me questions as we go, and I can try to answer them verbally. Again, this is a project that Stone started with Fitzgerald Environmental, and I'd say the two leads on the project have been myself and Joe Bartlett, who's also here today, and we're going to tag team a little bit on these slides. Without going into more on the preliminaries, I'll get into it a little bit. If you have questions, please ask them as we go to make this more of a dialogue. So we are currently monitoring 11 streams, stormwater impaired streams in Chittenden and Franklin counties. This slide lists the stream names and the municipalities. Obviously, some of these streams, watersheds span municipal boundaries. Some municipalities have the dubious distinction of having maybe more of these stormwater impaired watersheds. And this is a very wordy slide, but I just want to kind of bring this back to where this started, if I could, briefly. And it's really that these water bodies, generally small streams draining directly to Lake Champlain, don't support some of the aquatic life criteria, or do not fulfill the aquatic life criteria. So, and that can be for a variety of reasons. But what the state has determined is that the primary reason these water bodies don't support the aquatic life criteria is excess stormwater, and that can have there can be chemical issues related to that, but there's also just strictly a habitat problem associated with excess stormwater runoff, scouring stream banks and stream channels, creating sediment deposits, but also just sort of the physical alteration of the habitat in some of these streams. So stormwater then is being used as a proxy for sort of a suite of pollutants, and the goal then is to do a couple of things, to tamp down the extreme high flows in these flashy streams, and to increase the depressed base flows in these streams, some of which are reduced to essentially a trickle or less in the heat of the summer. The state and its consultants have defined a flow duration curve for each stream. And this sort of defines a continuum of the flow condition in comparison to a reference condition. And I just picked one. I picked the flow duration curve for Stevens Brook in St. Albans. And just to illustrate what we're talking about, I know everyone's familiar. I just think it's before we dive into a very long-term monitoring program, I want to sort of set some of the fundamentals here. But looking at the flow duration curve for St. Albans, for instance, the predicted flow in St. Albans is actually less than the reference condition throughout almost the entire spectrum, throughout almost the entire flow range. So if we pick a point on this graph, like let's say 50%, 50% of the time, the flow in St. Albans, which is the red line, should exceed about 1 cubic foot per second per square mile. And you'll see that the reference condition, Tennybrook, I repeat, do people have the audio?
We're just, sorry, Dave.
You're still working on that.
Dave Wheeler, can you hear us?
Type in a message if you can hear us or can't hear us. Well, I can't hear us.
Okay, I'm gonna pick it up, and apologies for people who can't hear us. There's a lot to put together, trying to set up the Skype. So at that same 50% mark, Tennybrook has a predicted flow rate of about 1.4 CFS per square mile, rather. So what that's saying is that even half the time, Stevens Brook is the flow in Stevens Brook is actually less than would be desirable to sustain aquatic life. The most critical point on this curve, however, is actually at the less than 1% mark, the 0.3% mark, and that's a target flow range that you can see how Stevens Brook is below the reference condition throughout the entire continuum until you get to this. This is a kind of a blow up. The inset graph is sort of a blow up of the extreme left of the graph, and it blows up that 0 to 1% exceedance, and you can see that those lines don't cross until we get to about 0.5%. So Stevens Brook is less than its reference condition throughout 99.5% of the flows that we expect to observe. But in those extreme events, those lines cross. And that's really the crux of the problem at Stevens Brook, as these models have estimated, that at some of these extreme high flows, the 0.3%, Stevens Brook flows about 27% higher than it should under a reasonable reference condition. So that is as much as I should say about flow duration curves. But this is the kind of the foundation. This is the reason why we're doing the monitoring. What we're trying to do is we're trying to in all these locations I'll show you in a minute. We're trying to document the current condition and then show progress towards a flow regime that looks more like the reference condition and less like a flashy little urban stream. Here are the places that we established stream gauges. There are, in this graph, there are three kind of symbols. We've got these blue circles. Those are just standalone precipitation gauges. They all have telemetry, so we get all the real-time data from all these stations. But they're not associated with the flow gauge. The green triangles are stream gauges. Full installations with pressure transducers and staff gauges. We know quite a lot about these small cross sections that we're monitoring. These do not have tipping buckets associated with them. The blue combination circle triangle are stream gauges where we've also co-located a precipitation gauge. And the reason we did that some places, not others, is because in some places we had just too much tree canopy cover. I mean, obviously, it's a lot more efficient to be able to just add a rain gauge to an existing station that has data loggers and telemetry and everything else, solar panels. So, but what we tried to do, and you can kind of see it here. Sorry, St. Albans is in the upper right-hand corner. We tried to create. Well, there's one gauge near the mouth or the lowest downstream point of the stormwater impaired reach on each stream. And that was what Joe and I, in selecting these sites, worked towards, is finding the best spot on these streams near the lower end of the designated stormwater impaired stream without any tributaries coming in between that sort of compliance point and our gauge. And we actually, in all 11 spots, I think we achieved that pretty well. These gauges form a network between the precipitation monitoring stations. Between the gauges, the stream gauges that also have a tipping bucket rain gauge and the standalone rain gauges, we have a network of 10 weather stations, essentially, rain gauges that we've installed. And we're also going to be working with municipal partners on 2 or 3 additional rain gauges to sort of fill out our network a little bit better. But it's a pretty spatially dense network of precipitation gauges. So we expect to have, from these gauges and some interpolation among these gauges, be able to represent unique rainfall totals for each watershed on every day. At some watersheds, that's just going to mean the one gauge near the middle of the watershed. That is the average aerial precipitation received in that watershed. Some of these others will have 3 or 4 scattered in and around the watershed, like Potash Brook, for instance. And we'll be using a area weighted average of those gauges to define the daily precip total. I just want to show you, this was maybe one of our easiest installations, Joe, I felt like. This is in Stevensbrook and St. Albans, the one we saw the flow duration curve for. What we've got going here, I don't know if people can see my cursor or not. In this instrument enclosure, we have a data logger, we have a bunch of electronics, and we have a modem. And this is where we bring the wires from the pressure transducer into this enclosure. So from here, from this enclosure, we're constantly transmitting. We're transmitting every hour the data. So that's as near real time as we can realistically get without incurring, lots of cell charges and in any case. So our program updates every hour. From here, we've got a pressure transducer that runs down this section of steel conduit out into the water. We've dug it into the bank just a little bit, moved some rocks to sort of keep it covered, and we install that and anchor it to the stream bottom. I'll show you 2 different kind of anchoring systems. This part of actually is the most work, running this steel conduit down into the water. So that when we get ice freezing on it and very high flows, we're pretty confident it's not going to rip out. I mean, there's no guarantees that we won't have. We certainly will have some damage along the way over the course of a 3 to 5 year monitoring study. But Joe and I really were resolved to build things as solid as we could, so that we limited the damage and repairs. And we'll see this spring, I guess, how things hold up. In the background, there's a staff gauge, and most of you are going to be familiar with this, but the sort of standard way to measure flow in a stream is to take periodic measurements of flow rate and compare them to measured level or stream stage. So that's all we are really doing here. We've got this great ruler in the stream, the staff gauge, And periodically, we check the level of the ruler and take a flow measurement. And we do that with a variety of techniques, the most appropriate techniques for the site under that flow condition, to develop a relationship between the stream flow and the stage in the stream. And then we take all our, stream flow data, our 5-minute stream flow data, and we basically run it through that equation. We take our 5-minute stage data, rather, our corrected, calibrated stage data, and run it through this rating curve, this relationship between stage and discharge, to compute discharge. So you can see all that in this picture. Here is a kind of a bedrock installation where we're attaching our conduit with threaded bolts and epoxy into, well, this is a boulder on the stream channel. We've actually have some anchors right below this boulder to anchor it directly into the bedrock. This conduit is just setting, this length of conduit is just setting on top of the boulder while we install these anchors. This is Indian Brook. I'm not going to show you every one of these. I would say every one of these is unique because we're really working with the channel conditions to install something that's going to stand the test of time and provide the best measurement. Indian Brook is also kind of typical. We have a very large boulder on the stream in the stream bed here that we've anchored to here where it's visible, and also where this elbow comes down into the channel, that's anchored sort of on the underside of this boulder. So this end, which is going to be subject to a lot of force, hopefully does not move. This staff gauge is installed in the stream on very large diameter rebar. It's on actually a decking board attached with these custom brackets that Joe came up with, attached to rebar, and there's also another supporting section of rebar at an angle that's driven down into this sort of right at the base of this rock. All right, and then that conduit runs up to the enclosure. I'm not going to show you all the sites, but I just want to show some non-typical situations that we also dealt with. On Monroe Brook, there's a large diameter, there's an 18-foot diameter culvert under Bay Road. And what Joe and I decided here was that this was the best site available, but the problem with this site was that it was very insensitive. And what that means is a substantial change in flow would not produce a significant change, a measurable change in the level. So without these plates, what I'm saying is the level comes to the top of this concrete baffle in front of the culvert, and it'll start spilling over, and that thing is just laid very horizontal. So in a few millimeters of increased level, the flow rate is going to change dramatically, and that's a bad situation. So we kind of want to narrow the channel down a little bit and make it more sensitive. So when I say we installed weir plates, this isn't a weir that we're going to use a weir equation to calculate discharge. This is just a way to produce a more desirable stage discharge relation. Because now let's say a doubling of discharge is going to produce an easily measurable flow. Rather, a few percent change in discharge should produce a measurable flow, given that we installed these weir plates. Similar idea at Morehouse Brook. We got permission from the town of Colchester to do a slight modification on the culvert that we're monitoring, just to make it a little more sensitive at the low end. So now we should be able to tell the difference between, whereas if it's a round pipe, that the lowest flows in a round pipe are disastrous for trying to accurately measure flow rate. So we just tried to change that slightly by giving it a V in the culvert, at the culvert entrance. You can see the staff gauge over on the right. Here you can see the pressure-reduced transducers installed in this conduit, which is anchored to the bottom right sort of bottom center of the screen. This was probably the place we spent the most time. This is a weir that USGS had built on Anglesby Brook and let fall into disrepair. This is in Burlington. It was on this far side, undermined, so that the low flows were just running right underneath the weir. And we thought about just abandoning this entirely, but there really wasn't another good spot to monitor. And if we could get this to work, we could actually use a weir equation, a weir equation that we would check repeatedly. But so we had a lot of reasons to sort of invest more in this structure. We dug it out. We poured hydraulic cement down there. We had this great thing where we had this ramp over on your right. We tossed sandbags and bags of concrete down the bank over on this ramp, and they'd come skidding out onto the on the sort of the concrete pad here. So we used a lot of sandbags and quite a lot of concrete to put this structure back together. And then we replaced the weir plate just to sort of make USGS happy. We used exactly the same dimensions as the rusted out weir plate we pulled out of there, which is an odd dimension. It's like 119 degree V or something odd, but we want to just replicate it exactly as close as we could. So this is all custom fabricated in metal. The last one I'll show you in terms of sort of difficulties is Rug Brook. The reason you're seeing snow here in the picture is because all these others, and Joe especially actually put most of the work the groundwork into securing permissions. 5 of these are on state or municipal property, but the other 6 are on private property, and we've got access agreements for all those 6. But that access agreement took us until mid-December to get on Rug Brook. It was literally 3 months of negotiation. It's with a private industry in the industrial park up on Rug Brook. And, well, one consequence of that was we really didn't take any discharge measurements before the channel was already freezing over. But we did, and we've got a gauging station up and running now. But that was actually a really pretty major effort with this company's legal department to get us in there, because it was really the only spot we could monitor on this whole stream. I'm going to turn it over to Joe. He's going to talk about some of the discharge measuring techniques we used.
Okay, hopefully you all can hear me. So Dave already mentioned briefly it's the rating curve development process. I'll go into that in a bit more detail. And as he said, we employ many different methods for measuring flows that are site dependent and, more importantly, flow dependent. And I'll walk through just some of the few different things we've successfully used this past field season. So the lowest low flows are very important for establishing that end of the flow duration curve, and they're also fairly challenging to measure. At our sites that have a fairly even but very soft bottom stream, usually they have lower velocities. We have a Baskey cutthroat flume, and basically you install it all the way across the stream channel so that all the water goes through it, and then once you get it leveled, you can very quickly get a measurement that just looks at the difference in hydraulic head between the entrance of the flume and then the exit of the flume. And so the actual measurement itself takes all of 10 seconds once it gets stabilized, but you have to dig it in and get all the water going through the flume. So this is it. We use that at both Bartlett and at Anglesby Brook. And then at Monroe Brook, this is actually a better view of the inside of the culvert. So when they replaced the Bay Road culvert, probably in the last 10 years or so, they put in these really interesting baffles that go back and forth and basically make meanders. And then there's these deep pools in between the baffles, all set up for fish passage. But it also made it really hard to measure discharge. And so what we ended up doing is we just cut a piece of 2x12 and then stuck a PVC fitting on it. And then we put foam across the back. And we just clamp it to one of the baffles and then wait 20 minutes while the water builds up, and then stick a bucket on the back end with the stopwatch, and it takes 30 seconds to fill up, and you do that a few times and you get probably the most accurate measurement possible using that setup. And then we also used volumetric measurements at both Englesby Brook, where we could stick a bucket in behind the notch in the flume, or in the weir, and then also at Morehouse Brook, where we could just put a bucket at the culvert outlet. And then for the steeper channels where we can't do volumetric measurements, we completed continuous rate salt addition measurements. And so this measurement is also very accurate, but it requires thorough mixing. And so it's really only appropriate in the streams that have enough turbulent flow through a short area to completely mix the salt solution that we drip into the channel, completely mix it into all of the water that's flowing through the channel. And so we did salt additions. So this picture is at Centennial Brook, and then we also did salt additions at Allen Brook.
Allen.
This is Allen.
I think that's-
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. This is Allen Brook. So we did Allen Brook, Centennial Brook, Bartlett Brook for the continuous rate salt additions. And what we this summer was actually quite likely the lowest flows we're going to observe potentially in the entire 3 to 5 year monitoring period. Some of the channels basically went dry. So we did spend a lot of effort trying to get these flows in case we don't see them again. High flow measurements that are still weightable, we have the very standard method USGS mechanical flow meters. It's the AA price meter for larger flows, and then the pygmy meter for smaller flows. And that's based on both velocity and depth. This is a measurement at Potash Brook using a AA price, some of the highest flows we saw all summer. And so for this, you just run a tape line across the channel, and then you collect usually around 30 measurements along the channel, where you measure depth and then the width of the measurement and then the average velocity through that portion of the channel. And then here is a preliminary rating curve that we developed. This is for Indian Brook. We selected this one because we really never had high flows this summer. And so Indian Brook, we actually captured a nice, moderately high flow using the AA price meter. And so that makes this rating curve actually pretty strong. And as the project continues, our goal is going to be probably to get 15 or so measurements to fill in all the gaps on the rating curve. And from each year, so long as nothing moves dramatically in the channel, we can continue to build on the same rating curve. If we have a really large flood or if a bank fails at a site, then we will have to just start a new rating curve and just assign different parts of the data record to the corresponding rating curve. We don't have any pictures yet, but we bought a very fancy new toy for measuring the highest high flows. And it's a acoustic Doppler towable unit that basically mounts to what looks like a boogie board, and you tow it across the channel, and you can measure very high flows, or you can also measure very large, deep channels. We have not yet had a chance to use that because we never had the flows for it, but we're hoping to figure that out probably in the Winooski River right next to Stone's office sometime in the spring, and be ready to use that as soon as we get big storms on our larger watersheds next summer.
So
and
this
then,
one thing that you might,
Yeah.
this curve will probably see 10 times this flow.
oh, easily, yeah. So,
Roughly. So this is real. This will become the low to moderate portion of the
yeah.
curve.
So this flow, I think it was just under 13 CFS. This channel will, the spot where I took this measurement will probably still be weightable at around 30 to 40 CFS, and then any flows beyond that we'll have to use the towable unit. But we will absolutely get measurements in the 6 to 10 CFS range, and then also try to get 3 or 4 measurements higher than the highest reading there. And that is actually one of the benefits of having this continuous telemetry, which you can even view on your cell phone, which Dave will go into next. When you know you need a flow around 10 CFS, you can just look at your phone and see that the stream is at 9.5 CFS and slowly climbing, and then hop in the car, drive there, and get your measurements. It'll actually really expedite the rating curve development process. And then we just recently got in our order of time-lapse cameras that after tomorrow will be installed at all of the sites. And so it's just a standard, fairly high-end kind of game camera. They're made by Cuddyback, and we have them programmed to take one picture every hour, and they are equipped with an infrared flash, and so we will get pictures overnight also. And these are primarily used as sort of a backup for if we ever lose a pressure transducer or if we have a data gap, we can actually fill in the data based on pictures of the staff gauges. And they will also be really useful for when we're trying to determine ice conditions in the channel. If we get when we finally get spring melt conditions, the camera will give us a good idea as to at what point the channel is ice-free enough that the flows should actually relate to the rating curve we establish for that site. This picture is from Potash. We'll do a quick. So at Potash Brook, the staff gauge on the left is the historic USGS staff gauge. It's mounted to bedrock, but on a pressure-treated post. It's very rusted and pretty wobbly. So we installed a new staff gauge that goes all the way up to 6.5 feet tall on a probably 300-pound steel bracket that's mounted to bedrock right next to the USGS staff gauge. And we are recording both their readings and our readings anytime we're out there, so we will be able to tie into their rating curve some, although the channel has changed since they were last monitoring there. But it'll be informative, and it's a very good spot for a staff gauge. And then this picture didn't quite turn out. I didn't quite have it aimed right, but this gives you an idea of another site. This is Centennial Brook. I will re-aim the camera, but
Infrared.
Yeah, with infrared. Okay, and then Dave's going to come back and talk about our independent precipitation monitoring stations.
Right. So where we couldn't simply connect a rain gauge to an existing data logger and telemetry system at a stream gauge, we put independent. We've got 5 independently recording stations, and this is a pretty sophisticated setup just to measure, for a point measurement of rainfall. It's all individually telemetered, and should somebody be interested, this could easily be expanded to a full-scale, pretty science-grade weather station. It's really just the only parameter we're measuring here is rainfall. But this is in Williston Village, right behind the town offices, and our little panel there is dwarfed by its big brothers in the field. This is another one. This is on Nowland Farm Road in South Burlington. And the reason I'm showing this is because we've got 2 kinds of precipitation gauges. I'm skipping around here. The gray gauge is a conventional siphoning tipping bucket rain gauge. And the tall black column is a snow cone. We've just set this up, so unfortunately we did miss some of the winter. But the idea is that this snow cone here is filled with antifreeze, and as dry precipitation or mixed precipitation enters the snow cone, it displaces that antifreeze, which is measured in the tipping bucket down below. So this provides, there's a little bit of a lag time as snow and ice melts in the antifreeze, but it provides a measure of ice and snowfall. And I think we have a question there.
That'll be covered on the next slide, I believe.
Okay. So we have these ice and snow cones at 2 sites, and for winter precipitation, really, we're going to be dependent on these 2 sites that have this ice and snow cone set up, and snow measurements at the Burlington International Weather Station, National Weather Service Station. That's all. We've got photos of every site, but I think we'll spare you those unless somebody's interested. what we've produced so far in terms of written deliverables to date are a site selection report. You've seen a lot of the pictures from that. A quality assurance plan detailing all the methods for this study, and an instrumentation report talking about a lot of things we've been talking about just now, but in greater detail with model numbers for this and that kind of thing. But these will be available. We can post these on the website if you like. And lastly, what we've done is develop a website, actually 2 websites. And I'm going to click on this should just pop up in my browser, and you should be able to share it that way. I think Christy sent around the URL for these sites. The front page is just about the project with some contact information. Joe and I are both listed on that front page. The second page is the site map, which I showed you a slide of. The third tab is final data, and of course now we have no final data. All the data we've collected to date is provisional. As we develop and refine rating curves, we're going to turn the stage data from this fall and winter into discharge data. But that will be, we can only do that really after we get enough flow measurements and have solid enough rating curves to make those stage discharge relations. And the rest of the tabs, there'll be links to the final data, and those will be posted about quarterly. So if you're interested in the flow data, and below there's a table of precipitation data for download. So once it makes it to here, we're calling it good. All these rest of the tabs display recent data from the stream gauges, and this is all provisional. And I would say, there's a lot going on here that will require correction, frankly. We have ice jams built up, and at times and in places. There's, for instance, so I'm giving you as many cautions as I can. We've calibrated all these tipping buckets, some of them repeatedly. So sometimes there are very high rainfall totals, and that's us out there with a funnel calibrating these gauges. And those kind of events, if they need to get removed from the provisional data, obviously, before the data are final. So, sometimes you'll see 2 inches, and it wasn't 2 inches. It was Joe or me or Evelyn or somebody out calibrating the gauges. Okay, so what you're going to find here, there's a battery voltage, which is maybe the most critical piece of information if you're managing a network of stations. And for the most part, these are holding their own. So we had to add extra solar panels to a couple of them that were in the woods. Frankly, we had to cut down some trees that were preventing enough solar exposure. And we had to, in a couple of spots, we've had some snow built up. So we can see that. We'll see the voltage start to plummet. The modems are actually sort of energy hogs. We see the modems start to plummet, and then we know we have to sweep off a solar panel or something like that. Over on the right, you have water temperature. And that is basically on board with a pressure transducer. And at this time of year, it's always just about 0, 0.25 degrees. But it is flowing by this pressure transducer, so that's a real number. The air temperature, it's actually not in the scope to provide continuous ambient air temperature data. What this is, it's pretty close to that, but it's basically a little wire attached to the data logger in the instrument enclosure. We might try to do so in any case that it's going to be that instrument enclosure insulates it a little bit from ambient conditions. That white box does. We might try to get a thermistor outside of that enclosure if we can find something affordable enough, recognizing that it wasn't in our scope to begin with. below, so what you're seeing on these graphs, in red, that's the stream stage. You can see the axis on the left is stage in feet, and the column graph is total rainfall in inches. I probably should have started by explaining that. But so you can see on this date, we've got 0.25 inches of rainfall. That was actually probably snow melt. There could have been some rain at that time, but you can see the stream responded to it. We've got this precipitation, and the hydrograph, you can see the response in the hydrograph. And below, you can see 5-minute, hourly. We changed it to hourly data, and this goes back a couple of months. Again, all provisional, but this is particularly helpful if we, when we're out, calibrating, checking the calibration of the pressure transducers, we can do it. We actually have a mobile app that does it as well, but we can check what the instrument thinks it's recording against what we see on the staff gauge to line those up pretty effortlessly. All right, and what you'll see here is instantaneous discharge is in development because that is waiting for our final, for our rating curves to be completed. But yeah, you can scroll and look at the rainfall from any time in the last, couple months. It's a little slow, but the scrolling. So the other sites are much like Allen Brook. I'll just show you anything that's different. Bartlett Brook, because it's so small, several of these we had to remove the pressure transducers for fear that the stream was going to freeze to the bottom and destroy our pressure transducer. And winter monitoring, stream flow monitoring, is just fraught with difficulties. And so that's sort of us trying to look out for our expensive instruments. And we'll have to make relationships off of the other gauges where we are continuing to monitor for some of these streams where we didn't leave the instrument in the ground, in the stream rather. So that instrument's pulled, but you can see we're still getting, the air temperature, the water temperature, yeah. The water temperature is actually the temperature recorded on the pressure transducer that's stuck in that conduit well above the water level. So it's stuck in the conduit to protect it. So that water level, for where the sensor has been removed, those water levels, that's actually that's the air inside of the conduit. There's enough disclaimers on that. I didn't think I could explain that. So Centennial also removed. Englesby is that weir that we repaired is great. We're going to end up relying on Englesby pretty heavily to make our sort of daily discharge estimates for the other streams over the course of the winter. But it's been pretty free-flowing. I mean, Joe and company have been keeping it open to some degree, but it's been flowing free. So that's in. Indian Brook is out. Morehouse is out. We're still recording precip at Morehouse. That was definitely going to freeze. Monroe Brook also going to freeze at the bottom potentially. Potash Brook, I should show you just because there are two, we've actually got two pressure transducers here and two staff gauges. The downstream one is essentially in the same pool as the USGS measured, but Joe had concerns about the variable hydraulic control here from previous monitoring. Wasn't crazy about the USGS spot, so we also wanted to supplement that with one just upstream. They actually track pretty well. But our idea, and we're going to, do a lot of comparisons between these two sensors and the resulting discharge. The idea is that we're going to be using the downstream sort of former USGS location gauge for medium and high flows, and the upstream gauge, which is the one in red, for low flows. The upstream one has a very confined channel, and so it should be very sensitive at those low flows. Rug Brook, you don't see much. this will correct itself. It's looking at a bizarre data point that happened when we had to replace the battery. So that will look like the others in a few days, I think. Nothing. It's not really broken. It's just a visual problem. Stevens Brook is in and pretty responsive, even through the winter months. Sunderland Brook is another one where we have tipping bucket, and you can see the response in the stream to the rain, for instance, we had on February 8th. So, unless there are questions about that, I guess I got to close this screen to be able to see any questions and get back to the webinar. Right. Okay. Right. So at hourly intervals, and at least at this time of year, really just between 8 a.m. and midnight, our server goes out and pulls all these 16 stations, pulls the data loggers, and appends all the new data to databases in a SQL server. Sort of a dedicated computer server that is backed up regularly and has an offsite backup, and so that's our repository for data. These websites that I'm showing you actually points at those SQL Server databases. Yeah, and I mean, when we get in the summer, we can make that a 24-hour data call in if we want. At this point, we're just trying to preserve battery because the modem is sort of is energy hungry, so we turn it off at night. Yeah. And I'll show you these. This just displays the standalone precipitation gauges. Remember, we have a total of 10 gauges out. 5 are at these streams. These are the standalone ones. But it also lets us look at the batteries, checks the communication status. They're all communicating, and provides a live feed of the precipitation data. And this, I will say that this was something we did. It's not actually in the project scope, but it was simple enough to create that we put it together too. So if you're interested in, some of you might live pretty close to these stations. You've got a way to check your instantaneous rainfall or your daily totals. That's really, I think that's all I have. I have slides of every stream if we wanted to get into that, but what other questions? Any other questions from the participants?
Oh, Dave's typing.
Okay. You want to add anything? Whatever. Yeah. That's a really good question.
So for those of you who aren't seeing the little pop-up bubble, Dave Wheeler's asked, when do you anticipate providing the first flow duration curves?
I might hedge on that a little bit. I mean, we're at some places, I think, assuming we get some at least moderately high flows and measure discharge, and I think we should be able to do that. That's really an annual data. So we want a full year of data, full year of finalized data. We're doing this a little bit one step at a time. So I guess there's no deliverable date for those exactly in our work plan. but I think it would be something we'd try to do by probably this time next year, and then continually revise at pretty much across the board. We should be able to do that. I mean, rug, maybe we won't add it because it was so late in the game.
Yeah.
But about this time next year, we should have our preliminary flow duration curves representing about a year of data. Oh.
No, it's okay. Chelsea just texted in that she was having sound issues, but I will type to her, but speak to you all first that this is being recorded, so if that all goes according to plan, then, oh, great, Chelsea. We're recording this, and so I will figure out how to download this recording and post it up to the website so that everybody who wasn't able to attend today or did have sound issues can watch it at a later time. Thank you, and I appreciate your patience with us in this webinar.
You guys have any thoughts of other, maybe flow duration curves take so much data? I mean, I think the original ones were based off of 10 years of data. Any other maybe intermediate parameters that we could be looking at and comparing to get a sense of whether or not, where we're going and how it's looking compared to the reference frame?
So Jen just
Well,
asked,
it is.
so maybe Jen might.
Yeah, you want to read it, right?
Yeah, so Jen asked if there's any data we can use to compare to our original data before those flow duration curves are ready.
Any parameters?
Any parameters?
I mean, I think looking at it, that isn't exactly in the scope, but I think looking at the range of flows we're seeing, I believe the picture will become fairly clear. I mean, all these flow duration curves are based on modeled data. There are very little empirical data informing them, and I think it'll become fairly apparent early in the game about where, how realistic those curves are. Do I have another way to, look at that? Yeah. Well, I mean, it's something we can talk about. I mean, even a flow duration curve for 1 year isn't going to. It's not, but if it's very, very different and we haven't had a particularly atypical year, I think that will be pretty informative. And if we get, I mean, we saw the low flow end at most of these streams. If we get some high flows and our spring is sort of in the middle of the range that we expect, a year could be kind of telling. But I don't have sort of other statistics at the top of my head. Blaine might really have some ideas on that. Yeah.
Group, not necessarily your doctor's not part of the scope, but this group.
Yeah.
Other things we could pull out of this data.
Yeah. Certainly. I mean, and there's been a fair amount of discussion of flashiness indices. Some things are happening, and looking at stream response to rainfall events, and if that was something DEC wanted to do and we could help with, that would be doable in the short term, anyways. And I mean, some of that will be interesting even just on an event-to-event basis. Is how big an event was it, and and how the stream respond. And Blaine probably has the best handle on all the metrics we might use in making those sort of that analysis.
Speaking to that we have the data, which has best statistics.
Right.
Ray Mueller's also asking if we can link, if they can use links, I think.
Yeah,
Alright.
sure. It's definitely public information. Definitely feel free to post these on your websites. Maybe point them back to yourselves for any questions on the caveats, because Dave Braun was explaining a lot of those caveats on the temperature and that this is preliminary data. So definitely make a statement about that.
And a lot of that, a lot of the disclaimers are on that front page. So if you if you encourage people to access it by the front page and read it through, it'll be a little more clear what it's actually representing. Bill, anything to add?
Yeah, like coming into the question.
I think Blaine is asking me again how we download the data. So all right, do you want to pick a question and read it for everybody? Which
Sure.
question should we
Yeah, so
try to
where
answer?
have we gotten?
The bottom of Blaine's one says, can you review how to download the data? Right, thank you. Blaine, the first version of this website had a download for the preliminary data, and especially based on some of the concerns you expressed and not wanting to disseminate a lot of data that includes, for instance, our calibrations, some clearly erroneous stuff. We took that off and we just replaced it with this final data page. So currently there's no data available for download. It's simple enough to put it up. The one problem with that downloading of provisional data page is the way that was built. It didn't allow us to edit it at all. That's sort of a Campbell scientific interface, and we weren't able to tweak it at all, so we couldn't put any of the disclaimers on that individual page, the provisional data download page. So that made it all the more dangerous, I guess. Now what are we saying?
So Jenna had a question. So as we implement different aspects of our FRIP, should we be notifying Stone as that happens? No. Blaine here is working with Stone and to analyze the data, but the FRIP reporting should be in the semi-annual reporting, and Emily will work with Blaine to look at those targets and monitor how the MPs are being implemented and any effects that those are having.
Okay, well, Blaine, I'm glad you agree that taking that the provisional data download off is a good idea. If you change your mind, let us know. Yeah, and when the final data will be downloadable on the CSV, at all these different intervals for all the streams.
Do we have any other questions? Blaine is making another comment or question. Great. Said thanks, a ton of work for sure, especially the angles be weird. Seriously, that's pretty impressive.
That was a lot of fun, really. Yeah, and lucky, the stream was almost dry.
It wasn't as bad as we thought it was going to be.
You were pretty worried.
I was pretty worried.
You were pretty concerned. Yeah, no faith.
Just in the respect of everybody's time, we're going to wrap up here. If there are additional questions, feel free to email me, copy Blaine. We can definitely get in touch with Stone for you and kind of coordinate any additional comments or response or questions. I will work on downloading this webinar today. I'm trying to get that up on the website, and I'll let you guys all know the status of that. But definitely be in touch with any more questions. I really appreciate everybody's participation today and patience as we work through this. So thank you all, and we will be in touch.
Thanks, Christy.
You have control of this,
I do.
so you can.
I should just